when James Stephens, Thomas Clark Luby, and about a dozen other fellows gathered in a timber yard in Dublin on St. Patrick's Day night and swore each other in to the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Now, it was sometimes referred to as Irish Revolutionary Brotherhood, but it was always IRB, either Revolutionary or Republican. And the immediate sequel to that swearing-in event was that James Stephens went on an organising tour around Ireland, looking for fellow Republicans, fellow revolutionaries. But in fact, the Fenians had been beaten to the punch by Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, because Rossa and some friends of his, the Dowlings, the Moynahans, and a fellow called Donald McCarthy, all from West Cork, from the Skibbereen general area, had already established an organisation called the Phoenix Literary Society, a very thin disguise for a band of hard men. When Stephens finally encountered them, the Phoenix Society had already been in existence for a couple of years. We're not exactly sure when it started, but it's around 1852 or 3. So when Stephens comes down to West Cork, he finds this ready-made band and swears them all in, well, 90 of the 100 that were part of O'Donovan Rossa's following. And there is circumstantial evidence, though I can't prove it, that the two central figures I'm going to talk to you about tonight were sworn into the IRB, into the Fenian movement, by O'Donovan Rossa. Because before Stephens made that organising tour, Rossa had already reached out from his base in Skibbereen, west to Rosscarbery, and north to the Macroom area. And Macroom is whence my two heroes came. But, because this is sort of a movie, we now jump to the very end of the story. Because on the 1st of August 1915, the IRB, revivified, reorganized, revived and invigorated by the figure of Tom Clark, returned from exile in America, and Sean McDiarmid, and we've seen them in those portrayals in the film. Had essentially organised or led the organisation of the Irish Volunteers. The Irish Volunteers were joined by Connolly's Citizen Army, by Cumann na Mban, by the Hibernian Rifles, the armed wing of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and by the GAA and all sorts of local public bodies of various kinds, county councils and whatever, all represented at this huge funeral that they mounted for O'Donovan Rossa. When word got back to Ireland that O'Donovan Rossa had died in New York, Clark sent a cable to John Devoy immediately. Send him home. We will bury him here. The body was transported back to Ireland, and that funeral was in essentially the minds of most witnesses. The volley of shots, fired, 3 volleys of shots fired by the volunteers over the graveside of O'Donovan Rossa are, by all accounts, that's the beginning of the 1916 Rising, because it was the first time that the whole future IRA appeared together on the streets, organised, disciplined and armed. And at that funeral, the oration was given by Porrick Pierce at Tom Clark's insistence, against the resistance of some of the other IRB men, but Clark said no, he has the touch And when Pearse said to Clark, how do you want me to do this? He said, go as hard as you like. And Pearse did. His opening remarks were about O'Donovan Rossa, calling him that unrepentant Fenian, which is exactly what O'Donovan Rossa was. He was a very irascible man. Mind you, he had grounds to be irascible, as did Tom Clark. They both went through excruciating torture by the British in various jails. And at the end of the oration, the famous last words are, life springs from death, and from the graves of patriot men and women spring living nations. The defenders of this realm have worked well in secret and in the open. They think that they have pacified Ireland. They think that they have purchased half of us and intimidated the other half. They think that they have foreseen everything, think that they have provided against everything. But the fools, the fools, the fools, they have left us our Fenian dead, and while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. So now we jump back. That's 1950. Now we jump back to 1858. O'Donovan Rossa was arrested in October 1858, and around the same time as those, and also along with probably about 15 of his comrades from the Phoenix Society who had now become IRB men. And around the same time, and I don't know the details, I can't find any evidence, but I suspect that that may have been the trigger that brought my two heroes, Jerry and Frank Gallagher, from Macroom, County Cork, to North America. Because we know that they left towards the end of 1858, I beg your pardon. They started out Boston, New York, Philadelphia. It's not clear. There aren't any records, but they quickly turned up in Canada. Now, I'm going to jump forward again to the end of that story and come back. On Sunday, the 15th of August in 1909, the Feast of the Assumption, 9,000 people gathered at Grosse Ile. Many of you will know about Grosse Ile. It's the little island that was the quarantine station in the St. Lawrence River. The officiates and dignitaries included Monsignor Antonio Sparetti, the papal legate to Canada, Louis-Nazaire Bégin, Catholic Archbishop of Quebec, federal and provincial cabinet members, including Charles Murphy, Secretary of State for the Dominion of Canada, and Charles Devlin, Quebec Minister of Colonization and Mines, Sir Charles Fitzpatrick, the Chief Justice of Canada's Supreme Court. Did you notice anything about those names? And leaders of the ancient order of Hibernians who had paid for the event, because the event was the unveiling of the huge, it's 40 meters tall granite Celtic cross on the highest point, Telegraph Hill on Grosse Ile. Now, the four faces of the cross, and people who've been to the island will know this, will have remembered it, will have noted it probably. One panel lists the names of priests who died, who tendered to, cared for the famine refugees in 1847, plus Father Michael Power, or Bishop Michael Power, who contracted famine fever, working in the fever sheds in Toronto and died, and Father Hugh Paisley, similarly dead in Quebec City. Now, the north and the two opposing side panels on the north and south faces of the base of the cross are in English and French, and they're essentially the same. The English says, "Sacred to the memory of thousands of Irish emigrants who, to preserve the faith, suffered hunger and exile in 1847-48, and stricken with fever, ended here their sorrowful pilgrimage erected by the ancient order of Hibernians in America and dedicated Feast of the Assumption 1909. But then there's the Irish inscription. Caille Clan na Gael in Miltiv are an Ilon Sword Deach. In English, the translation is, "Children of the Gael died in their thousands on this island. fleeing from the laws of foreign tyrants and an artificial famine in the years 1847-48, God's blessing on them. Let this monument be a token to their name and honour from the Gaels of America. God save Ireland. I'll come back and explicate a little bit of that in a minute. So what had happened was that in a letter to the AOH convention in Boston in 1900, Jerry Gallagher, who at that time was the leader of the AOH in Quebec City, explained that in 1897, mindful of the sad fate of so many of our kindred, and it being the 50th anniversary, our division of the AOH organised a pilgrimage to the island. Service for the dead was held, and a sermon appropriate to the occasion was preached by the Reverend Rector of St. Patrick's Church, Quebec. There was a large gathering of our people, and the proceedings were most solemn and impressive. However, the desolate and neglected aspect of the particular portion of the island allotted to the resting place of so many of our blood and our faith seemed to strike us with reproach. After careful consideration of the matter in division meetings, we have concluded that it is our duty to see that this hallowed spot where so many thousands of our country people are buried should be reclaimed, be becomingly enclosed, and have a befitting monument with suitable inscriptions in Gaelic, in Latin, English and French, not only in memoriam of the unhappy Irish exiles, but also as a protest against the misgovernment of which they were the victims. The AOH agreed and voted $5,000 as well as a levy of 10 cents per member to go to the creation of this, to this project for Jerry Gallagher. The monument was designed, according to Jerry's son Dermot, the monument was designed in pencil sketches on the kitchen wall in his house in Quebec. And as the money kept coming in and more of it arrived, he became more ambitious and the cross grew larger. Now, the island's foremost historian, in fact, is Jerry Gallagher's granddaughter, the late Mariana O'Gallagher, died 2 years ago, May. But she's a little diplomatic, perhaps a little economical with the truth, when in her history of the island she says that the inscriptions on 3 sides offer the same message in Gaelic, in English and in French. Well, clearly they do not. And the 3 elements in the Irish inscription that unmistakably identify its Fenian origins and intentions are laws of foreign tyrants, artificial famine, and the slogan adopted from the Manchester Martyrs, the slogan that they shouted in court when they were sentenced to death in 1867, and that's God Save Ireland. So, to use an anachronism, Gallagher's Irish inscription can be described as speaking truth to power. And in this case, I think it's plain that he understood that the truth, his rendering of Mitchell's dictum, that God sent the blight but the English made the famine, needed to be disguised in Irish. Peter Toner, who's one of the 2 historians of Fenianism in Canada, says Gallagher demands some attention. No kidding. Jerry was born in 1837 in Macroom. His brother was 2 years older, so in 1858, when they were recruited into the movement, they would have been 19 and 21. They were perfect candidates, big, bold, strapping young men who had survived the famine. And Jerry remembered later in life gloating over the families families who were his neighbors, who had made it through a period of the hunger by killing a deer on the landlord's estate. And I'm absolutely sure that you know, being 10 years old in the depth of the Great Hunger scarred Jerry Gallagher. It left a serious mark on him. Now we know, although they originally went to the United States, we know that they couldn't have stayed there very long, because Jerry's first job in Canada was as a timekeeper on the construction site for the Victoria Bridge in Montreal. And when the workers digging the foundations for that bridge on the North Montreal side of the river, they found the burial site of famine victims who had died at Point St. Charles in Montreal, and they dredged this huge rock, it's called the Black Stone. They hauled it out of the river, and they inscribed it, "To preserve from desecration the remains of 6,000 immigrants AD 47-48. This stone is erected by the workers of Messrs. Pito, Brassey and Betts, employed in the construction of the Victoria Bridge AD 1859. Now Mariana has examined did examine the very few handful of photographs of that event, was unable to find her grandfather, but I can't imagine him not having been there. I mean, I'm convinced he was there for sure. Had he been there long enough to have some influence in, you know, in the event, the creation of the monument, the inscription? Don't know, can't tell. In the early 1860s, the elder brother Frank was already established in Quebec City, teaching at the Sillery Academy. Jerry joined him on the staff at the academy and furthered his own education at the Séminaire de Québec and the Sainte-Anne-de-la-Pocatière College, where he took degrees in engineering and surveying. He also taught at the college English, mathematics and Irish. On the face of it, one might be tempted to see a contradiction between the Catholic piety and Republican militancy reflected in the inscriptions on the Celtic cross, but I don't think they're that contradictory. Jeremiah Gallagher was a devout Catholic and a committed Republican. There's no doubt about it. His energy and capacity for work were exemplary, and finally his diplomacy must have been remarkable. Both facets of his character, as displayed on the cross at Gros Isle, are embodied in his life and work. For 40 years, from 1869 to the unveiling of the cross at Gros Isle, Gallagher balanced full-time employment as a highly regarded waterworks engineer and surveyor for the city of Quebec, with unremitting organisation and agitation for physical force nationalism in a long series of Irish organisations in the city. All the while, he was an active member of his parish and a trustee and accountant on the management committee overseeing St. Bridget's Orphanage. Later in life, he joined the St. Patrick's Total Abstinence Society, and typical of Jerry Gallagher's character, according to Mariana, was that when he decided that he was going to go teetotal, he took the bottle of whiskey and he poured himself a big glass and drank it and said, "That's the last spot of whiskey I'll ever touch," and proceeded to become a teetotaler. He was a member of his parochial League of the Sacred Heart of Jesus and a member of the Quebec Catholic School Commission, and had St. Mary's Academy built for the growing Irish population in the city. So, but those are sort of the nice, polite, gentle parts of Jerry Gallagher. Let's look at some of the other stuff. Among the Irish organisations in Quebec in which Jerry and Frank played leading roles, several can with some confidence be identified with the Fenians. This most certainly applies, by the way, just sort of as an aid memoir, just to remind you, James Patrick Whelan, who was hanged for his part in the shooting of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, that event was 1868. And we are now going to start talking about all the years after 1868. Okay, so some of these organizations can certainly be identified as Fenian. For instance, this certainly applies to the Hibernian Benevolent Society. They both held executive positions in the Hibernian Benevolent Society from the mid-1860s into the 1880s. Peter Toner reckons that Frank Gallagher was the most likely candidate for having been centre of the Quebec Fenian Circle in 1865. It's very probable that the St. Patrick's Literary Institute and Debating Club was at least a Fenian front. The Emmet Skirmishing Club, the name speaks for itself, fundraising for O'Donovan Rossa in the Quebec suburb of Sillery in 1876, left no records, but it is probably safe to assume that the Gallaghers had a hand in it. And there's a police report somewhere that the Emmet Skirmishing Fund in Quebec City provided more money than everywhere else in Europe, in Canada put together, for O'Donovan Ross's dynamite war. They also organised two constitutional bodies, Fianna Fáil, semi-constitution, with the clear intention of steering them along physical force lines. In 1881, Jeremiah was busy, and it seems comfortable, with the new departure when the Fenians formed an alliance with Parnell and the militant elements in the Irish Parliamentary Party during the Land War. It was controversial, and there were a number of divisions within the IRB over that development, but it was very successful at first and in its initial developments, and then it became, as some of the Fenians had predicted, it became a drain on Fenian resources and manpower in particular. Okay, constitutional forces. Jeremiah was comfortable with the new departure. On the 7th of July in 1881, Fanny Parnell, Charles's sister, visited Quebec and was received by the Irish with an address of welcome composed and read by Jeremiah Gallagher. Indeed, he was a member of the Quebec delegation to meetings with Parnell himself in Montreal, and in November of that year, as vice president of the Quebec branch of the Land League, he attended the Land League convention in Chicago, but at the same time as that convention was being held, and under its curtain, behind its curtain, the United Brotherhood, that is to say, Clan McGale's underground organisation, held its own secret convention, and Jerry Gallagher was named district member, or officer commanding, OC, for Canada at that United Brotherhood convention. And the Brotherhood's directive to its members was plain. Excuse me, sorry. When land leagues are formed, no pains should be spared to secure control of these movements or organizations by members of the UB. A few of our good men working in concert can always manage to secure this control. Lest these organizations may at any time prove dangerous rather than assistance to our work, we should so secure the control of their managements as to be able to disband them if that ever became necessary. And we know that Frank and Jerry already had this plan well in hand, because 20 years earlier, in 1873, the Quebec Hibernian Benevolent Society, Jeremiah was corresponding secretary at the time, created a branch of the Home Rule League, ostensibly to support Isaac Butt and the Irish Parliamentary Party at the time. Toner is a bit diplomatic. It is probable that the Quebec Hibernians preferred to control any branch of the Home Rule League in their city rather than allow moderates to organise and control one. There was a British spy at the United Brotherhood Convention in 1881 who reported that Jerry was, quote, a violent Fenian, unquote, who had knowledge of dynamite activities in Montreal. Presumably he's referring to the Emmett Skirmishing Club. And in 1888, another British spy reported that Jerry had sent $1,000 to Clan Gael to be used for the appliances of civilization, i.e. explosion and outrages. That's all in quotes. But then there's a sort of oddity about this violence question and Jerry Gallagher's attitude towards it and so on. This is a story that Mariana tells, and she says it's mysterious because of one pronoun. At some point in the Irish Republican Brotherhood history, Jeremiah had received a message to go to Lévis, just across the river from Quebec City, and meet a certain man, evidently a spy, sent to report on Quebec activities. Jeremiah was to deal with him. According to Dermot, the son, Jeremiah recognized the person in question, followed him onto the Lévis ferry, stood beside him at the rail, and contemplated his next move. He was to throw him overboard, but he thought of his eternal soul and he could not do it. Since the story was told in the third person, this is Mariana writing, I cannot determine whether grandfather Jeremiah was thinking of his own soul or that of the spy he was supposed to deal with. On the other hand, there is no doubt whatever that Jerry Gallagher was a physical force Fenian, a nationalist, a physical force nationalist, a Fenian. His son Dermot told Peter Toner that while Jeremiah was prepared to work with the moderate home rulers for Irish freedom, he was convinced that only armed rebellion could achieve that end. And Mariana added a qualification. Jeremiah believed that only force could ever remove the British from Ireland, but that violence on this side of the ocean was pointless and out of date. Which is to say that the Fenians had drawn the lesson from all the Canadian Fenians. Fenians in this area. There was a Fenian circle in Hamilton based on Yonge Street. That they had all drawn the same lesson from the failures of John O'Neill's campaign, two campaigns. The invasion and battle at Ridgeway in 1866 and the subsequent attempt in Manitoba in 1870. In the 1880s, after the demise of the Land League, Jeremiah Gallagher was connected to two more explicitly Fenian organisations. He was on the executive of the Irish National Association in 1883 and Canadian delegate to the Irish National Brotherhoods Convention in 1887. And then we round up this list with the Ancient Order of Hibernians. Founded by Jeremiah Gallagher in Quebec in 1895. So the question is, why did Jeremiah Gallagher, and this actually is an important question, why did Jerry Gallagher initiate and lead the AOH in Quebec, an organisation which in Ireland was a rival and foe of the Fenian Irish Republican Brotherhood? Part of the explanation is that there had been some kind of a split in the AOH. There was an AOH which was right-wing, sectarian, green-orange men, if you like, green men, and was particularly strong in the north of Ireland. In the US, however, the AOH tended to not fight with the physical force nationalists, not to get crosswise with them, not to actually cooperate, but not to get crosswise. But I think there's more another explanation, and that can be found in a letter from Robert Johnson, who was a Fenian leader in Belfast, a member of the IRB Supreme Council, and he's writing to John Devoy in New York, urging Devoy to get the Clan na Gael to work more closely with the AOH. This is Robert Johnson. A considerable number of our friends throughout the country have lately joined these divisions with the object of leading them in the right direction, and the support and approval therefore of the order in America would be an encouragement to them in their efforts. And in fact, the AOH recognized this because in their official history they report that at the same time militant Fenian Brotherhood began to infiltrate the AOH and run their people for top AOH offices. So in short, as far as I'm concerned, the AOH was Jerry Gallagher's last Fenian front organisation, the last of his long career. Now, while Mariana was writing the book and talking about the 3 inscriptions and being tactful and diplomatic about them, in 2009, on the centenary of the unveiling of the cross, the AOH in Montreal and Quebec organised another big demonstration at the cross and invited Mariana to speak there and at the dinner on the night before. At a dinner on the night before. And at the dinner, she said, the Gaelic inscription was written by Jeremiah, but he called upon a well-known scholar of the day, Major McChrystal, that's Edward McChrystal, of the 69th Regiment of New York, the Fighting 69th, to read it and comment. In their letters, Jeremiah insists on the term artificial famine to describe the situation of 1847, and from the letters one can gather that these men were in touch with people in Dublin too over the inscription. At the unveiling, Charles J. Foy, who's National Director for Canada and was from Ottawa and had long been an active militant Irish nationalist in the area, was now head of the AOH in Canada, and his speech elaborated on the English and French inscriptions. Suffice it to say that we assemble here today for the purpose of showing our respect to the dead who died for Ireland, also to show our appreciation for the devotion which they had to faith and fatherland. Never did Ireland draw a sword unjustly, but solely in the defence of the highest, holiest, and best of causes, the altar of God and the altar of the nation. Dreadful stuff. Matthew Cummings, who was the American head of the AOH, was made of sterner stuff. Today we are assembled to unveil and dedicate this magnificent Celtic cross to the memory of those poor Irish immigrants who were hunted like wild beasts from their native land and who died victims of pestilence and fever on this bleak island, far from the land they loved, far from friends and relatives, their only comfort, their religion, and the sight of the brave and saintly Catholic priest bringing the last sacraments of the church to them. But the last word literally went to Edward McChrystal and to the Fenians. And he gave his speech in Irish. And John A. Jordan, who was a reporter for the Quebec Chronicle, covered the event in great detail and published a splendid souvenir book about it in 1909. Anyway, he reproduces McChrystal's speech in Irish without a translation. I had to go to my friend Pádraig O'Shiel at St Mary's University in Halifax to get a translation. This is what McChrystal said. Before the majority of us were born, more than 12,000 people perished and were buried here. They were fleeing from the laws of tyrants, from famine and from plague. They were destroyed by England, but we are hopeful. No, we are certain that they found peace with God in heaven. Our native country is in bondage still, and our people are ruined. But I say to you, and listen to me, as certain as we are here, as certain that there is the memorial above our poor destroyed dead, the Gaels will not forget what the Englishmen did to us, and the day will come, the day of the revenge of God, and on that day some of us will be ready to strike a blow for Ireland and her cause. That's the unalloyed stuff. That's the Fenian line. It's the line of James Stephens and Thomas Clark Luby, of John O'Leary, of John O'Daly, of Tom Clark, and Sean McDermott. Jerry Gallagher died in Quebec City in August 1914, 2 years before the blow was struck in Dublin at Easter 1916. And I'll leave the rest, because the rest is about the history of Grosse Ile and the campaign to preserve and make it a serious memorial to the famine refugees. But that's my story about. Let me just see if there's anything. No, I think that's it. That's my story about Jerry and Frank Gallagher, and how Fenianism, in fact, didn't die in 1868 on the gallows when James Patrick Whelan was hanged, but in fact lived on and played an important part in, particularly in Quebec. I don't have room. I haven't done the work, but I wouldn't have the room. But there's another whole story about Montreal as well, and about the curious collections of Fenian sympathizers dotted around in small towns, villages even, in the maritime provinces. But that's perhaps for another day.